Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today, heading straight into the thick of World War II with the legendary Flying Tigers.
It always amazes me how much there is to uncover with the Flying Tigers, even after all these years.
It's true. And today we're focusing on one particular pilot, Robert T. Smith. To help us paint a picture of his experience, we've got excerpts from Robert T. Smith's P-40 Warhawk and the Flying Tigers,
Oh, that's a great resource.
and some extra details from a website called, now get this, Whiskey Juliet from Valdosta, Georgia.
Whiskey Juliet. Now I'm intrigued. That's got to be a story in itself.
Right. Okay, so I have a confession. When I first saw a picture of Smith's P-40 Warhawk, I was a little underwhelmed. Compared to some of the other famous fighters from World War II, it seemed, well, kind of plain.
I know what you mean, but that's kind of what makes it so interesting, right? There's no instantly recognizable nickname or flashy paint job. It's almost like a hidden gem. Well, except for one detail, of course.
You're talking about the shark mouth.
Yeah, the shark mouth. You can't talk about the Flying Tigers without picturing that iconic nose art.
You're right. It's practically a symbol for the whole group.
And just imagine yourself as a Japanese pilot back in 1941. You're already facing this mysterious enemy, and then you see this snarling shark coming straight at you.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
Exactly. It's a pure psychological warfare. They even saw it on the German Luftwaffe Bf 10s in North Africa before that. It was meant to intimidate.
No, I had never really considered the impact it must have had on the other side. It's so much more than just a cool design.
Oh, absolutely. It really highlights how every little detail, even something like nose art, can play a role in the psychology of war.
So behind those intimidating shark teeth was our guy, Robert T. Smith, a pilot from Nebraska.
Yeah, RT, or Bob, as he was known. Born in 1918, and you can tell, even from his early life, he was just drawn to aviation. He earned his wings in the U.S. Army Air Corps. But then, get this, he resigns to join the Flying Tigers.
Wait, he left a stable military career to join a volunteer group? And to fight on the other side of the world, that's a huge risk.
It really is. It speaks volumes about his personality, that adventurous spirit, his patriotism, and, well, we can't forget the financial incentives. The sources mentioned that those were pretty attractive to a lot of the pilots, too.
I can see how that combination of danger and opportunity would be hard to resist for someone like Smith. But it takes more than just guts to be a successful fighter pilot, right? What kind of pilot was he, skill-wise?
Oh, he was the real deal. Smith racked up an impressive 8.9 official aerial victories.
8.9 confirmed kills? That's incredible.
It puts him right up there with the top aces of the Flying Tigers.
You don't get a record like that by accident.
Definitely not. It takes skill, coolness under pressure, maybe a little luck too.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. Like you said, the shark mouth was more than just a cool design, and now we see that Smith was more than just a thrill seeker. There's real substance behind this image.
Exactly. And that brings us to another thing that really stood out to me about Smith. His meticulous record keeping. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was documenting it in detail.
Almost like he knew he was part of something historic.
That's a good way to put it. His written accounts, photographs, even the mission notes are incredibly detailed.
It's a good thing he did that too.
It really is. Thanks to Smith's thoroughness, we have this incredible window into the everyday lives of the Flying Tigers. It's invaluable for historians.
So you've really got me curious about the Flying Tigers themselves. It sounds like something out of an adventure movie, this secret group of American pilots fighting in China even before the U.S. officially enters the war. How did that even happen?
It's a pretty wild story. Okay, so to understand the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, we need to go back a bit to the late 1930s. China was already in a brutal war with Japan, and things weren't looking so good for them.
I can imagine. So there was this desperate need, but how do you just go and create a secret air force?
Well, that's where Claire Lee Chennault comes in. He was a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer. At the time, he was working as an advisor to the Chinese Air Force.
Okay, a retired officer. But to pull off something like creating an entire air force, you'd need some serious pull, some influence.
Oh, he definitely had connections. He somehow managed to convince President Roosevelt and some other important people that helping China with their air defenses was in America's best interest.
And this was all before Pearl Harbor, right? When the U.S. was officially neutral.
Right. So they had to be careful, find a way to help without directly getting involved in the war.
Ah, so that's where the AVG comes in, a separate entity technically not part of the U.S. military.
Exactly. The pilots and ground crew were recruited from the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, the whole deal. But officially, they had to resign their commissions and become civilians, at least on paper.
It all sounds incredibly risky. What would make a pilot sign up for something like that?
Well, put yourself in their shoes for a second. You're a young pilot, late 1930s, the world's on edge, war's brewing, and then this offer lands in your lap. A chance to fight for a good cause, experience real adventure, and on top of all that, make a really good salary.
I can see the appeal. It must have seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
And we're not talking about mercenaries here, you know? These were skilled pilots, real professionals who believed in what they were doing.
So we've got the pilots figured out. What about the planes? I know they flew the P-40 Warhawk, but was that really the best fighter plane available at the time?
Well, it wasn't necessarily the most advanced, but it was a good fit for what they needed. The P-40 was tough, reliable, you know? It could really take a beating.
But hold on, wasn't the Japanese Zero supposed to be better? More agile, maneuverable, all that?
It was, in some ways. But the P-40 had its own advantages. 6.50 caliber machine guns packed a serious punch, and that ruggedness I mentioned. It was a lifesaver in the conditions they were flying in, over in the China-Burma-India theater. I mean, think about it. If it wasn't for that durable P-40, it's hard to imagine Smith surviving some of those missions with all the damage his plane took. And you've seen his meticulous records. He doesn't exaggerate.
That's a good point. And of course, you can't forget Chenault. He's the one who came up with those tactics, right? The ones that allowed the Flying Tigers to hold their own, even against a superior enemy.
Right, Chenault knew they couldn't beat the Zeros in a straight dogfight. So he focused on hit-and-run tactics. The Flying Tigers would use the P-40's speed and firepower, make these quick, devastating attacks, and then get out before the Zeros could react.
It sounds almost like guerrilla warfare, but in the air.
Exactly. Surprise, speed, precision. And Chenault really drilled into his pilots the importance of teamwork. Coordinated attacks, you know, carefully timed maneuvers to overwhelm the enemy. It was a real shift from that individual dogfighting style that was so common back then.
So he was a bit of a visionary, a tactical genius.
Oh, for sure. And his tactics worked. The Flying Tigers inflicted some serious losses on the Japanese, all while keeping their own casualties relatively low. Their success, it had this huge impact, you know. It gave people hope, this symbol of resistance. It wasn't just in China either, but back in the US too.
Amazing how such a small group, this secret group, could have such a big impact on the war. But the AVG was eventually disbanded, right?
That's right. July 1942. The US had officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor. The AVG had done what it was meant to do. It proved that the Japanese Air Force wasn't unbeatable. So the U.S. military decided to integrate them into the larger war effort.
So is that the end of the Flying Tigers then?
Well, sort of. The surviving members, they were given the option to join this new group, the 23rd Fighter Group, under the U.S. Army Air Force's command. Some of them stayed on, like David Lee Tex Hill. He continued fighting in the Pacific.
But not Robert T. Smith.
No. Smith and some others. They decided to go back home.
You know, that's really interesting to me. We've talked about his record keeping, how meticulous he was, but still, after all the action, the camaraderie of combat, it seems surprising that he wouldn't want to stay in the fight.
It's a good question. It's hard to know for sure what was going through his mind. Maybe he felt like he'd done his part, or maybe he'd seen enough of war, or maybe he realized he could contribute in a different way, make sure that what he and his comrades had done wouldn't be forgotten.
It's kind of strange, you know, Smith choosing to go home. It's like you'd think he'd want to stay in the action, but in a way, that decision let him make an even bigger contribution to how we remember the Flying Tigers.
It's true. It's like by stepping back, he was able to step up, if that makes sense. By so carefully documenting everything, his time with the AVG, and even after, he gave us something really special. A first-hand account, you know, from someone who was actually there.
And he's not trying to sugarcoat things either. He talks about the rough parts, the disagreements, the frustrations. It's not some Hollywood version of war.
Yeah, he's very honest about the whole thing. The tensions within the group, arguments over tactics, times when they felt like they weren't getting the support they needed. It makes the Flying Tigers feel more real, more human, you know.
They weren't these perfect heroes. They were just guys doing their best in a really tough situation.
Exactly. And their achievements, they're even more impressive because of that, because they had to overcome all these obstacles. It wasn't just about being a good pilot, it was about resilience, about adapting, about being totally committed to the mission no matter what.
We hear a lot about the bond between soldiers who've been through combat together. It seems like that was especially strong with the Flying Tigers.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think as part of why we're still so fascinated by them, you know. Despite everything, the hardships, the disagreements, the danger, They fought together, they had each other's backs, and they did some truly amazing things. And you can really feel that camaraderie when you read Smith's writing.
We talked about Smith taking a different path, and that really stuck with me. He could have easily stayed in the fight, tried to get more kills, all that. But he chose to focus on making sure that people knew about the Flying Tigers, that their story was told, and told truthfully. It's almost like a different kind of heroism, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. It reminds us that there are many ways to be heroic. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones fought on the front lines, but the ones fought to preserve memory, to make sure we remember what happened and who made it happen.
This deep dive has really changed how I see the Flying Tigers, and Robert T. Smith especially. A skilled pilot, a careful historian, and in the end, someone who made sure his comrades weren't forgotten. What a legacy.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Oh.
That even in these big, world-changing events, even in a legendary group like the Flying Tigers, every single person has their own unique journey. And it's those individual stories that really give us a more complete understanding of history.
That's a great point. So to everyone listening, if you ever come across a story about the Flying Tigers or really any historical event, remember Robert T. Smith. Remember that there's always more to discover, more to learn. Dig a little deeper, look past the surface. You might be surprised at what you find. Thanks for joining us on this journey back to World War II, and until next time, keep exploring.